Welcome back to Down the Rabbit Hole. Today, we're going to be talking about the grandmother of Europe and the Coburg-Kohary curse. Now, I had to combine these two because you can't talk about one without the other and everything. But with that being said, what do we know about this Coburg-Kohary curse? Well, but before I jump into that, go ahead, hit that like button, ring that bell for notifications. Also subscribe, help a girl out. Um, Now as we all know, I love history. This is hence why this is called Down the Rabbit Hole, where we talk about urban legends, people of history, weird history, and everything else. So, do we all know? So, with that being said, let's go. Let's talk about this Coburg Kohary curse. Mm. Hemophilia. Queen Victoria is known for passing the gene down to her children. And this has been also affected the royal families all over Europe. And according to Royal Babylon, the alarming history of European royalty, she had 9 kids and married them off to various nobility or royal families. And some of them even inherited genes of the disease. And according to History of Medicine, said that the subsequent intermarrying of cousins between meant that the chances of hemophilia presented was very high and greater to the general population. And one of Queen Victoria's own sons was a hemophiliac as well. And at the time, this was a death sentence. Hemophilia makes it difficult. So basically, what is hemophilia? Well, it makes it difficult for the blood to clot, which means also it could be fatal and it can cause agonizing um an agonizing death, and Queen Victoria didn't want to believe she had given birth to a son, um, given her son hemophilia, even though scientists looking at the family's history is pretty sure it came from the spontaneous mutation of DNA of either her or her father. Wow, she tried to blame her husband's side of the family, which is weird since they were also first cousins as well. So from the same family, Queen Victoria knew that the curse was supposedly put on by the ancestors, and one of the German branches of Queen Victoria's family was the Coburgs, and who were famously cursed. And this was the extremely rich and Hungarian noble Antoinette de Kohary married the family in 18 to the family in 1815, and a Kohary relative, a monk, was so jealous of the wealth that she and her husband inherited at their wedding the curse of the family with disease, and this might have finally been presented in Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren for crying out loud. So, Queen Victoria, what do we know about her? Well, we know she was born at Kensington Palace in 1819. She was the fifth in line to the throne. And honestly, if it wasn't for a succession crisis, she probably would not have been born. If we're looking at it like this, she wouldn't have. Um, but by the time she was 18, she had a quick accession of deaths among her relatives and would speed up her accession. And she accepted the crown as an inexperienced teenager, and she died at 81, and what would become known as the grandmother of Europe. Her marriage was to her first cousin, Prince Albert, and had been arranged that it had been a success and produced 9 children and 42 grandchildren, and some of whom are still ruling as monarchs today. She died in 1901 as Queen of Great Britain and Empress of India. So, Victoria Victoria was born May 24th, 1819. And it was seen in the dining room at Kensington Palace. Now, this seems like a strange choice, but there, hot water could be brought up more easily from the kitchen. And at the time of her birth, Victoria's uncles, the Prince of Wales, was acting as regent in the final phase of their father's mental illness. And the prince succeeded George III to the throne as George IV in 1820. So I did a whole episode on that about on my Dark Academia podcast on the Regency era and stuff, which you can go check out. Now, let's talk about her route to the throne, because we know about the Regency era, we know about all of that. So, but by 1818 and 1819, a succession crisis was looming. In 1817, George V's only daughter, Princess Charlotte, had given birth to a stillborn son. So, it was a match with that would make them that would literally make arranged marriage that would have produced Victoria. Okay, now let's talk about some of her royal relatives for a moment. There's George the Fourth, and everything. Then there's Princess Charlotte. Then there's William the Fifth. Well, William the Fourth. Wait, yeah, William the Fourth. There's the Duke of Kent. Um, there's baby Victoria, and there's baby Victoria. Let's talk about her early education now. From the age of 4, her mom employed Reverend George Davies, a patient and mild man, who tutored the spirited young Victoria as she took the throne. And she had a singing teacher, Louisa LeBlanche, who was an opera singer, and the princess showed a talent for art and was given lessons by Richard Restall, best known for best known for his portraits of Lord Byron. And Victoria later claimed that she felt lonely and depressed during the Kensington Palace childhood. And despite her companionship of her beloved governess, together they made costumes of Victoria's collections of dolls, and Victoria wrote stories, and the other great children's and everything. So we all know by now there's something that was called the Kensington system. And with the Kensington system, this was the Duchess of Kent, whose English was poor and depended more on the help of her late husband's equerry, John Conroy, who was ambitious and controlling and saw an opportunity to grow and influence the royal household. He did influence Victoria. He hated it. It ticked him off so bad. But if Victoria, the way this thinking was that if Victoria inherited the throne before she was 18, the Duchess would be made regent. And his plan was to bring the Duchess and Victoria under his control, and he instigated a strict set of rules intended to bolster up the power and position of Victoria's mom, who was unpopular within the royal family, and the rules became known as the Kensington system. And this meant that Victoria grew up relatively isolated at Kensington Palace. And although she was constantly supervised, not even able to walk downstairs without holding someone's hand in case she fell, the system and was called, as it is yet called, it sounds rather cruel. Victoria came to loathe Conroy in his attempt to control her. However, the system worked in her favor because she was rarely at court and she wasn't associated with her predecessors, her unpopular uncles George the Fifth and William the Fourth, or George the Fourth and William the Fourth. Anyway, let's talk briefly about her influences now. So we know Sir John Conroy. Now, like I said, Conroy was an officer of the royal household artillery. He had quickly risen through the ranks to become captain and displaying a talent for creating and implementing systems. He was appointed personal equerry to newly married Duke of Kent in 1818. Now, after the Duke's death in 1820, Conroy seized his opportunity to act as an advisor to a bereaved duchess who would act as regent should the infant Victoria accede to the throne. Now, another influence in Victoria's life. Well, is it really an influence that she grew up to hear her mom, and everything? But Princess Victoria's mom, Maria Louise Victoria, was the Dowager Princess of Lintington, and she was an attractive widow of 32 who first met the Duke, and she was the sister of Princess Charlotte's widower, Prince Leopold Saxe-Coburg Saalfeld, and she had two children by her first marriage, Theodora and Charles. And the Duke's untimely death left her burdened by his huge debts, along with the vulnerable to John Conroy's persuasive charms, and stepped to offer his assistance. Now, another influence, who is perhaps her favorite uncle, by the way, is King Leopold of the Belgiums, who was a high influence over her early life, and he was a member of the Coburg family, and became a British prince when he married Victoria's cousin Charlotte in 1816. Now, after Prince Charles's early death, Leopold kept a careful watch on Victoria, and Victoria looked up to him as a father, writing in her diary that he is the best and kindest advisor I have ever had. It was Leopold who introduced her to his nephew, Prince Albert. Next was her governess, Louise Luzzing, and everything, and she was also played a major part in her life, and she had a close companionship in her and everything. Now, let's talk about her unhappy childhood. We know she did not have a happy childhood. And while she was privileged enough, it was not as all is seen. It was described as lonely and unhappy and everything, and she misremembered her childhood as more miserable than it was, according to what some curators have suggested. And the evidence has of her doted mom doted to her and everything else. She was the nation's hope. She was a young princess who sometimes went on tours, and she recorded the impressions of these tours in her journal as well, and everything. Now, let's talk about the day that Victoria officially becomes queen. So, this was 1837, June 20th. She was awoken at Kensington Palace and was told visitors had arrived with important news, which she later would describe as I got out of bed, went to my sitting room alone, and when I saw him, Lord Cunningham, then acquainted me to my poor uncle, the king, was no more, and had expired at 12 minutes P2 in the morning, consequently that I am the queen. Now, surprisingly, Queen Victoria did not commission a painting as well. So, what about her first appearance as a queen? Well, she dressed for the day in a black mourning dress in honor of her uncle. Desperate to break free from her mom and Conroy, the 18-year-old calmly chose to make her first appearance as queen without them, despite being physically tiny, like 5'1" to be exact. Her confident manner had a great impression over the men and gathered to Ascension Court at the palace's rest saloon, and the Duke of Wellington described that she's not only filled her chair, but she has filled her room. And from this point, she never looked back. Now, what about her coronation? Well, she was crowned June 28, 1838, and huge numbers of people flocked to London so that they could see this and get a glimpse of her. Now, in her first year as monarch, she was scarcely put on her foot wrong. In her youth, in her youth meant her new reign was regarded as indulgently by the people who saw her as a fresh new era. However, a British appearance meant that she was consistently underestimated in the time of the wars and everything as well. Now, one of her most trusted advisors, and she even considered a marriage proposal to him, was Lord Melbourne. And she was still just a kid. Keep that in mind. She was still a teenager. And she leaned heavily on two most trusted advisor, her uncle and Lord Melbourne. And Victoria hung on Lord Melbourne's every word, possibly seeing him as a father figure, despite him being 40 years her senior. Now, there was something that she was infamously known for, and that was the Flora Hastings affair. So, this affair demonstrated Victoria's immaturity and made her temporarily unpopular. Flora was one of her mother's ladies in waiting and a friend of John Conroy, which caused Victoria to gratefully resent her. So, when Flora complained of a swollen abdomen in 1839, the royal doctor assumed she was pregnant. Even worse, Victoria accused her of having an affair with John Conroy, causing even more distress and encouraging gossip. Laura died of a stomach tumor a few months later, and a young queen was hissed at and booed by people outside of the Buckingham Palace. So this is where Prince Albert and her would meet, and they would later get married. So Victoria and her first Victoria had met her first met her German cousin in 1836, when he and his brother Ernst was visiting Kensington Palace with their uncle Leopold, King of the Belgians. And their family had a planned union almost from birth when the couple would meet again in 1839. And Victoria decided that she was ready to marry this handsome young prince, partly to help her royal duties and partly to win the public approval, but also for love. And as protocol demanded, she proposed October 15, 1839, when Albert accepted, and the couple embraced the couple and was overcome with joy. And so her wedding in 1840 to Albert was very public, and it was the first royal ceremony to be arranged with the enjoyment of the London's public in mind. She traveled to Chapel's Royal St. James Palace in an open carriage, and so everyone could see her. This was also to show this woman as well as a queen, and she had a simple white dress instead of a royal robe and everything. Now, for her marriage to Albert, Victoria would choose like a fashionable white satin court dress, and as there were so many guests in Chapel Royal, ladies had been requested not to add court trains to their dress to relieve the congestion and everything else. So, what was married life like for the two? Well, Albert was no different than many of the men his age who assumed he would take on a dominant role in the marriage. Wider attitudes would change and as to a successful marriage. And a writer at the time would counsel her female rulers as a happy relationship would be founded and everything. So, what about her? She had her first pregnancy in 1840, which helped ease the situation. When she was not feeling well enough, Albert was her daily government. So, we know that they had 9 children. Princess Victoria, um, let's see, then Albert Edward, then Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Now, as royal parents, they were had an interest in raising their children. And presented a happy family image, unlike many aristocratic fathers of the period and everything. And Albert would take charge, and you can see the subjects would approve if she devoted herself to her children and everything. And here's the thing: Victoria did not like children. Like, she did not like babies, to be exact. That's the thing many people don't get. But I'm going to talk briefly about her children real quick, okay? Victoria and Albert's eldest daughter, Vicky, was married in 1875 to a Prussian prince, and the man who become Kaiser of Germany, whose own son would lead to taking over starting World War I to be becoming the reason for World War I to happen. Can we guess who? Yep. Now, Edward VII, Bertie, as he was be called by his family, was Victoria's second child, the heir to the throne, and often disappointed his mom by the ways he lacked in seriousness and application. Princess Louise, among her Victoria's children, Louise was particularly intrigued people. She was highly creative, a supportive of education for girls, and married a commoner rather than another royal and everything. Um, but and Victoria and Alba's family grew against a backdrop and was marked by radical and unprecedented change and everything. And then there was this thing called the Great Exhibition, and at the other end of the scale, from the tough lives of working people and celebration of technological innovations and the expansion of the trade and British interest. Prince Albert was a highly intelligent man, so with a social contrast, interest in trade and everything else. So he was a yeah. So let's move on to the part I think Victoria is widely known for, and that was the death of Prince Albert. And she depended on his strength to support it and everything else. And they were in mourning and everything. But there was a grievance, but the family grieved and everything, and she was a widow. Now, I'm gonna jump briefly to a close friend of hers, John Brown. And I know there's a lot of information that I could talk about, but I'm trying to keep this as brief as possible because I know most people kind of drown out after so long. So I'm like, okay. But yeah, but John Brown was a close friend of hers. And she had a favorite of hers was a servant was Abdul Karlam and everything else. But yeah, she was also known as the Empress of India, and she was crowned the Empress of India on May 1st, 1876. Although her involvement had began years before, by the 1840s she was appalled by the behavior of East India Company and everything else. Let's talk about the death of Queen Victoria. By 1901, Victoria had grown very frail and had used a wheelchair, and she was losing weight. She had so much flesh that had shrunk to appear to her and everything else. And what were her last wishes? That she be brought back to London, lined with the streets and everything else. Now her funeral, she wanted her funeral done with respect but simply, and here the royals mourned and everything else. So she left a legacy behind, it is no doubt, and everything. And she was a mom, and it's no doubt she didn't have the best mom and everything, but she grew up different in a way, but she was also very privileged too at the same time. But Victoria, but she became known as the grandmother of Europe, and throughout the marriages of her children, other royal families, to create a network of alliances and everything between them and her children, gave 42 grandchildren by the turn of the 20th century. That's crazy right there. Even her own grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm II, would lead Germany into war in Great Britain in 1914. That's, yeah. But that is it for this episode. Join me next time as we talk about Queen Charlotte.